Yes, check, check, check.
E a apresentação está saindo?
It's speaking to my computer. I'll see it. Yeah. There's a black screen. Gente, boa tarde, tudo bem?
A gente teve um outro evento, uma palestra que aconteceu ontem, lá na Fórum de Ciência e Cultura da UFRJ. Foi um evento maior, a gente tinha mais recurso, então tinha tradução simultânea. Esse vai ser uma coisa mais íntima, mas também é mais gostoso, que a gente vai ficar mais próximo, vai ter a oportunidade de ter uma conversa que eu acho talvez até seja mais rica e mais específica, né? Que o tema da palestra de hoje é um pouco mais... Desculpa. Tinha que acontecer agora. Então, o tema de hoje ele é um pouquinho mais fechado e também interessante para quem conhece o livro, porque é uma coisa que está para além do escopo. Vocês devem saber que o livro do Benjamin foi traduzido no Brasil, acho que pela editora Garamond, e a gente considera quase que um best-seller acadêmico, né? Um livro que vendeu muito aqui, Guerra, pela Eternidade. E ontem, então, ele lá no Fórum de Ciência e Cultura, ele falou um pouco sobre o livro, explicou todo o trabalho que ele fez, entrevistando essas figuras exóticas, que foram Steve Bannon, o Olavo de Carvalho, o Alexander Dugin, e trabalhando então com a ideia do tradicionalismo, que seria o ponto em comum entre todos esses personagens estranhos da nossa história recente. E hoje ele vai falar sobre esse tema que também é um pouquinho hermético, mas tenho certeza que vai ser muito clara a apresentação, que é o tema da saída, exit, no imaginário, no pensamento que a gente chama, eu pelo menos chamo de neoconservador ou neorreacionário. E talvez até seja uma boa questão, né? Por que neoconservador? Por que neorreacionário, né? O que tem de singular? E Benjamin Teitelbaum, ele é etnógrafo, comentador político e professor de etnomusicologia na Universidade de Colorado, Boulder. Já foi o diretor da cadeira de estudos nórdicos. Ele tem um trabalho muito importante com culturas nórdicas, com música, né, nórdica. E agora, recentemente, então, tem investido nesse campo de mapear o imaginário, as ideias centrais que unem esse movimento em nível mundial da direita conservadora, da extrema-direita. Tá? E a gente vai ver que tem muito a ver com o Brasil, já que ele teve contato com personagens como o Olavo de Carvalho e outros são importantes, foram importantes e ainda são, né, em alguma medida, no nosso cenário político. Uma grande honra a gente tê-lo aqui hoje. Ele aceitou com muita boa vontade, muita gentileza, participar desses eventos todos. Está sem parar aqui, direto, fazendo entrevistas. Talvez apareça no Fantástico, no domingo, numa entrevista que ele fez sobre o livro. Tá? Então, esse é um tema muito importante, sobre o qual a gente não tem muita informação e que a pesquisa dele traz como uma novidade importante. Então, a gente vou passar a palavra para o Benjamin e depois que terminar, a gente abre a sessão de perguntas. Se vocês quiserem fazer a pergunta em inglês, pode fazer. Se vocês quiserem fazer em português, eu traduzo para ele também, tranquilo. Tá?
Muito bom. Obrigado, Henrique. A pleasure to be with you all today, and I hope it's okay that I speak English. I will speak slowly and do my best to be clear. But one thing that should help us in the conversation today is the fact that a lot of what I'll be talking about is music. And a lot of the music I'm going to be talking about doesn't have words, and that's the point. As Eiki was telling you, I've studied a lot of different things. And my official job title includes the designation ethnomusicologist. How would you say it in Portuguese? Ethnomusicologista. And my first work, the first research that I did, studied the ways that music interacted with far-right movements in Europe, and in Sweden in particular. And I was studying the aftermath of a time in Scandinavia when white nationalist, neo-Nazi, race revolutionary movements had turned to music in order to organize themselves, in order to raise money, and in order to sustain their spirit, to rally, to imagine a future where they were perhaps more powerful than they actually were. White power music was the name for most of what they produced. And in Sweden, there was a higher concentration of white power bands per capita than almost any place else in the world. And more bands total than you would find in all the other Nordic countries combined. That took place in Sweden at the same time as the country was underrepresented in terms of formal political representation of the far right. Sweden was one of the only countries at the time to not have a far-right party in its government. And thus, in the absence of political expression, in the absence of expression in formal party politics, music became the new outlet for their speech. Many years later, though, not only do we see the skinhead movement that was so strong in Sweden, not only did we see it wither and die, slowly, but nonetheless decisively. Not only did we see a wave of new music come and go from the far right, including, and this is another talk, believe me, white nationalist rap, white nationalist reggae, for real, white nationalist singer-songwriter, techno, and so on. We eventually saw the growth of another type of music. There's one peculiar difference from this music compared to all the others that had come before. Let's listen to an example. Tell me, what is something this music lacks that most other music has? By all means, we can speak to each other. Lyrics. It doesn't have words. It is music without words. Whereas the music of the past, the music that animated so much of the far right's causes in decades before, was centered so much on words that the music was almost secondary. Well, I've come to think as time has gone on that this lack of words, and the lack of words in particular in music, has something to say about the trajectory of far-right movements. We don't have these conversations. I never write, I never speak in a vacuum. I never am speaking to people who do not have some relationship to far-right causes in the world today. That's just the truth that we live in. I'm speaking after the former president in my country, Donald Trump, had just been indicted, as Jair Bolsonaro just returned to you here in Brazil. But this movement that has played out over recent decades has a current to it. It has a trajectory. It has highs and lows. And it has typically been the understanding of the far right that they live in a low. Most of their post-war existence has been an existence of failure in most of their eyes. We can criticize that, yes. But that is the pervasive self-understanding of much of the Western and non-Western far right. What we saw in recent years, if we consider that grander context, is something of an aberration, is something of an exception to the rule. when for a brief period of time the far right started to think that in fact the future was theirs. That may have departed. I think it's too early to say. But pessimism in various ways seems to be returning to the far right after a brief moment of optimism. But as I'm going to conclude saying in my talk today, that doesn't mean that they are necessarily benign. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Enrique was talking about my last book, Guerra, pela, Eternidade, about traditionalism. And that book, traditionalism itself and the music that I was just playing right now, I think belong to a broader phenomenon, something that we can put on top of all of them. And that is the rise of something called anti-politics. Now, anti-politics is a very difficult concept to define for a very, very simple reason, that in order to define anti-politics, you need to define politics, and we can't do that. But this might be an introduction to you all as to what I mean by anti-politics. This is a definition from a collection of scholars in the United States. That it is, quote, public disillusionment and disengagement associated with declining turnout at elections, declining membership of parties and political movements, and public opposition to paradigmatic policy agendas. To put that in simple terms, anti-politics could have to do with retreat, with pulling yourself out of the political process. That could manifest in the world of a voter who stops voting, in the world of a party member who stops attending meetings and participating. But it could also happen in more informal ways. If you, let's say, inside your own psyche, disavow the world around you and say that you're no longer going to be invested in the future of your community, your state, your society. All of that might be a form of anti-politics. As we look at the right recently, and I don't have a firm starting point for this, we can see a trend that has been strengthening. Different forms of anti-politics manifesting in different ways, all driving to that same end goal of removing oneself from investing in the political future. And I would suggest that there are four different types four different modes of anti-politics that are taking place today. I put them on this slide. There are actually stronger relationships here and here, as you will see. But these four modes are exit, saída, right? Accelerate, acelerar, silence, silencio, and babble. Babble meaning to speak nonsense, speak nonsensically. They're all slightly different, but again, what they do collectively is to pull themselves out of political processes that need the opposite of these things, that need, most crucially, trustworthy representative speech and discourse in order to function well. My book, Guerra, pela, studied traditionalism. It studied an ideological world that was embraced at some points during the life of Olavo de Carvalho, but also Steve Bannon and Alexander Dugin. It represents, I would actually suggest, one type of anti-politics and even exit or acceleration. And for that reason, I thought I would give you all a brief introduction to it. And I say brief because traditionalism is a spiritual school, it is a religious teaching for some, and it's only a political ideology in the eyes of some people, and only in some ways. Having said all of that, we can isolate a couple of ideas from traditionalism that were important to political actors and which relate to what I'm talking about here today. One of those ideas is that of hierarchy. Traditionalists believe that in a virtuous society, you would see the existence of a social caste hierarchy, perhaps something like we're used to seeing in the world, in the thinking of Hinduism, correct? But it was ordered in a particular way, ordered thusly, with priests atop warriors, atop merchants, atop slaves. The opposition there was not only one between quality and quantity, but also between spirit and material, with priests being oriented to immaterial values and slaves working with bodies, ultimate materiality. But it also, in the eyes of some traditionalists, opposed northerliness with southerliness, masculinity with femininity, whiteness in forms of Aryanism opposite non-Aryanism, or Semitism, such that to be priestly in the eyes of some traditionalists was to be masculinist, Aryan, northerly, immaterial, oriented more towards quality than quantity, and to be slave-like was to manifest all those opposite values. What's key about all this is that for traditionalists, it interacts with another idea, not just this hierarchy, but a time cycle. Also, this is something we would be familiar with from Hinduism, a belief that as time moves forward, it's always cycling, rather than moving in a linear fashion, where the future is distinctly different from the past. Instead, time is always repeating itself. The only movement that takes place occurs as we move toward a truth, something that's good, and away from it, and back to it again. And it is a time cycle, more specifically, that moves in a downward direction. You'll see here, it's no accident, the ordering of these ages, moving from a golden to a silver to a bronze to a dark. Which is to say that for almost every moment that passes, according to these thinkers, things get worse. Except for one moment. Can you see one moment when that is not true? That stage, from dark to golden. A minuscule moment in time when something cataclysmic happens, you are catapulted into gold, and then decline begins again. This may seem very basic, but there's a lot of important ideas in this. One of them being that what I just said to you, when I just was speaking and said that yes, for every moment that passes, things get worse, that's also kind of not true. You understand why? Can you guess why? Because the worse things get, the closer you get to gold. What is good and what is bad in this case? Who's to say? It's complicated. It's circular, cyclical. Now, for traditionalists, there's an interaction between these two ideas I just mentioned to you, such that in a golden age we have a priestly caste. When you move to a silver age, priests disappear, hierarchy itself starts to fall apart, and when you find yourself in a bronze age, you are living in an age where merchants and mercantilist ideals prevail, when government, culture are oriented around the making of money and the circulation of money. Is there a word, kleptocracy? Is there a kleptocracia? Would be the governmental form in the age of the merchants, opposite theocracia, in the age of the priest. And finally, the Dark Age is the age when all hierarchy disappears, where there are no borders between anyone, when everyone is part of the same mass. Quantity of bodies is all that matters. This is the age, in terms of politics, of communism and democracy, and certainly an age where there is no true spiritual values. Now, we could talk more about that, but what's important to take away for my purposes right now is this. Figures who believe in this way of thinking typically do not see a place for activism, right? What does someone do to affect this? Some figures on the right toyed with the idea that there was something to be done about it, that you actually could interact with this time cycle. A famous Italian fascist sympathizer named Julius Evola believed that, in fact, historical events were proving that you could reverse the time cycle. I'll explain briefly. He thought that he was living in 1930s and 1920s Italy in the Bronze Age. He thought that he was living in the age of the mercantilists, and that Italy was destined to either turn toward Western democracy or Eastern communism. Those were the only choices. But what happened as he was living in that fateful moment? He saw the rise of fascism and National Socialism And important to him was not merely the politics of these figures, but it was, and I use this picture for a reason, it was their style. The fact that they were richly decorated military men, warriors, in other words. That signaled to him that history had shown the time cycle could be pushed backwards. That the emergence of these warrior figures signaled that the Bronze Age could be forced into a Silver Age. And he devoted most of his time to trying to push fascism and Nazism back an additional step, to enchant it, to bring spirituality into fascism and Nazism, and to make Hitler and Mussolini into priests. He saw Nazism as merely a promising start. But of course things didn't work out that way. After the war he felt that he was actually mistaken. The brief glimpse of a silver era was just a momentary fluctuation of the time cycle, and instead they were indeed headed toward darkness. The post-war Evola devoted himself, therefore, to something else, and he used a metaphor to describe it. The metaphor was this. He said, imagine walking in the forest and encountering a tiger. And if you were to encounter that tiger, you would have a number of choices. You could fight it, but you're going to lose. You could run from it, but it will probably chase you down. What was his solution, do you know? What up? To the tree. Tree would have been very smart. He didn't think of that. He decided the obvious thing, climb up on its back. Get onto the tiger's back. And make yourself inconspicuous. Make yourself unnoticeable. I would have gone for the tree. But he said if you climb on the tiger's back, make yourself unnoticeable, the tiger won't reach you. You may have to watch in silence as the tiger eats other people who come into its path. But if you stay silent, if you are unnoticeable, someday that tiger is going to grow old. Someday that tiger is going to die. And when it weakens, when it finally falls from its legs, then you can move your hands to its neck and strangle it. That was his solution, in other words. It was to embrace once again, anew, the logic of this time cycle and say that in fact, an individual living in this period need merely wait, and wait quietly for the tides of time to carry you forward into a better age. Now that way of thinking occupies a couple of the ideas that I identify and ascribe to anti-politics. In it we see an embrace of exit, a rejection of participation in society, a belief that there's no real reason for you to involve yourself, to try and change the future, to try and improve your situation through your own energies. Nothing is going to happen to you, and honestly, the chances that something really bad could happen to you are even better. The tiger will devour you if you get in its face. So what you could do instead is to wait, or perhaps some would say, do something else. An alternative understanding of this way of thinking is to say that, well, we can't reverse the time cycle, but perhaps we can edge it forward a little bit. Perhaps its direction is set in stone, but not its speed. Right? Does that make sense? And thus we have this other idea of accelerationism, which occupies other brands of far-right thought. Its starting point is so often the belief that politics is dead, that society cannot actually improve itself, and that the only way for society to improve to ever be improved is if it collapses. Out of the ashes of collapse, something new and better can be built back up. Now the figures who embrace this way of thinking come from very different walks of life. This individual is named Peter Thiel. He is a multi-billionaire from Silicon Valley in the United States, but a crucial aspect of his work is that he is also a primary funder of party politicians in the United States. Those politicians include Josh Hawley, a senator from the state of Missouri, J.D. Vance, a senator from the state of Ohio, Blake Masters, a candidate, but who barely lost in the state of Arizona. But more than any of those figures, his primary source of donation has been Donald Trump, our former president, currently indicted. And his goals with his money and with a lot of his work was to try and find a way to break down the U.S. federal government. His goal was not necessarily one even of improving the lives of Americans in total. Instead, it was, if you asked him, about finding new ways for individuals to operate in this world, to break themselves out of dependency on their fellow citizens. So prior, to give you some illustration of how that agenda can manifest, prior to giving money to Donald Trump, Peter Thiel had been funding seasteading ventures. That is to say, agendas whose main plan was to build a floating city that could be sailed off into the ocean outside the jurisdiction of any state, and where true freedom could exist in that way. But a society that was broken down and still stayed in its place, stayed in its territory, might offer him a similar product and a similar benefit. But accelerationism can take place in many different ways. It doesn't have to simply be through politics. One figure that both I and Professor Felinto study is a figure named Nick Land. And Nick Land himself, rather than investing in party politics, had a different idea. And here is one illustrative quote from him when he is describing accelerationism. He says, "The point of an analysis of capitalism or of nihilism is to do more of it. The process is not to be critiqued. The process is the critique. Feeding back into itself as it escalates, the only way forward is through, which means further in." And I promise these are some of the more lucid words he offered, but it was his belief that exacerbating what was taking place in the world was the best way to bring its downfall. And the assumption of such a figure is that capitalism, for example, has in its DNA the seeds of its own destruction. So producing more capitalism will eventually destroy capitalism. Here's a picture of Nick Land himself in Bolivia in 1997. But if accelerationism and exit form relatively lucid examples of how someone could remove themselves from politics and still do damage, potentially, to our political life, silence and babble are somewhat more difficult to understand, I would say. To understand how silence and babble could be a confrontation to democracy, I think we would have to look back to theory of the public sphere and of lowercase r republicanism. According to those beliefs, the way that democratic societies should arrive at truth is through conversation and through public conversation. There is a faith, even a naive faith, some might say, among some of those early theorists, that through conversation we will eventually distill what is right and good about the world, and we will understand what sorts of public policies should be embraced in order to improve our situation. If that's the way we see democracy as emerging as an afterthought to conversation, to open discourse, refusal to participate in that discourse could be limiting. You're depriving the discourse of your own insights, which matter. Babble could be even worse. That is to say, speaking unfaithfully, saying things that you don't actually believe. That too could damage this process. And it was with that in mind that we see another stream of anti-politics emerge. Now, the first song that I played for you, I didn't tell you much about it. It was called Waldgang. Anyone speak German here? Okay. Waldgang means wandering in the forest, or a forest walk. or a forced passage, as a matter of fact. And the term refers to this thinker, Ernst Jünger, who's better known for his World War I diaries, chronicling his experience as a soldier. But later in his life, much like Julius Evola, this former German soldier decided that things were kind of lost in the public sphere, and that the only things that could ever be done would have to be done in indirect and secretive ways. And he offered an example of how this could take place. He gave an example of a vote, a referendum. Do referendums occur? Okay, referendos. He asked his readers in this text to imagine a referendum being put to a population. It would be the type of referendum that would get a lot of votes, that would have lots and lots of support. He suggests that the referendum was on peace. Do we vote in favor or against peace? Now, it would seem a silly question, perhaps, but he thought such a referendum would be very, very important to a state because it would allow the state to see who really supported it, who valued the order and the security that a state provided. If someone voted against peace, they would be immediately identified as an outlaw, a danger. And thus the state would hope that in its referendum it would get 90%, 95%, maybe even 98% of the vote in favor. But it did not want to get 100% of the vote in favor. Why? Because the state needs a minority. It needs a hated minority. It needs outsiders in order to justify itself, in order to make its own repressive measures necessary in the eyes of a population. And so Ernst Jünger imagines, well, what would you do if you're living in a society, as he was, a post-war liberal democratic West that he hated? What should you do in such a society to undermine it? If you announce yourself, if you jump in front of the tiger, if you vote no on the referendum for peace, you will have merely contributed to a statistic. You will have merely identified yourself in the eyes of the states, and you will be there to continue and motivate and justify repressive measures. So what did Jünger suggest you do instead? Jünger suggests you vote yes, in the hopes that you and all other dissidents would push that measure closer and closer to 100, and thereby make yourself invisible, and thereby eliminate a language of voting in this case, undermining public discourse and depriving the state of insight at the same time. Those are some ways. That's at least an example for how babble and silence could be instrumentalized and perhaps used to contribute to something dangerous. And perhaps it's no exception in that case that so much music that cites Julius Evola, that cites Ernst Jünger, has, like the first example I had, so few words. And sometimes it's not even just an absence of words. Let's listen to another example. This is coming from an artist named Death in June, part of the same broad milieu as the first song I played for you. This one has some text, but it also has something in between text and silence. Excuse me, I played, the clip was not the one that I thought was there. But this will give you an overview of what else is often heard when people use their voices in neo-folk. So we'll listen once again. Vocables is what we call them in English. La la la, do do do, mum mum mum. Non-words, sung syllables, almost taking the place of words, appearing in spots where we would expect words to occur in music, but depriving those words of any denotational content in semantic capacity. And they appear throughout neo-folk. And what is curious to me is that as you look at other far-right expressive culture, especially after the skinhead wave had moved on in large parts of Australia, North America, and Europe, we see lots of examples of music without words, people without faces, demonstrations without banners. The hard bus flash mob movement, which had which appeared a little bit in South America and Chile, at least I know of, is one example of this. People getting together, wearing masks, doing dances in public places, taking over a space, but ostensibly saying nothing with it. And in the world of music surrounding the election of Donald Trump, we saw the emergence of Fashwave, which is an offshoot of an online meme music genre called Vaporwave, often adopting stylized expressions of 1980s music and imagery. And occasionally this music has had words to it. I'll play you a clip of Fashwave. This particular clip has a small section of text, about the only type of text we ever hear in these cases. It refers to something called the 14 words, which is a primarily neo-Nazi white nationalist phrase, a sort of creed that says we must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children, used as a sort of anthem to organize those causes.
The alt-right exists because the 14 words are necessary. The alt-right exists to take us from here to there. The alt-right exists because it is time. We were indeed born too late to explore the Earth, and too early to explore the galaxy. But just in time to secure the existence of our people and a future for white children.
That type of language, actual quotation of political speech, in this case it was coming from a famous YouTube alt-right blogger, would seem to go in the opposite direction, to not be any more patient, to lose patience with lyrics in songs and instead insist on declarative political speech. But it's an extreme exception in the world of Fashwave. I will give you an example of an artist, Zurius, who contributed to the last track, for a much more illustrative version. Wordless music, it goes on for quite some time. like that. And this, to the best of my understanding, is the most recent far-right musical innovation that we have to work with. Again, aside from a few exceptions, primarily wordless. What does it all mean? What can we say about it? I would turn to one of the few instances where the author of that music had something to say himself before offering my own comments. The artist behind that, Zurius, as he's known, rarely gives interviews. He's never responded to my requests for interviews, but he did have this conversation, a taped conversation, when he talked about the references in his music, the citations of the 1980s, the way the music sounded, and what it all meant to him. And here's what he had to say. I hope this comes through clearly.
Nostalgia, I think, it's a very powerful and beautiful emotion, actually. But I'm not just trying to make people lament a past that possibly never was, or dream for a future which cannot be. I'm not really trying to do. I mean, I'll just come out and say it. I think the true nostalgia, one of the reasons nostalgia is such a powerful emotion is because what we really long for is reunion with the divine. That's what, right? That's what I really think. So So nostalgia there will always be extreme, but there'll always be a longing for this thing which we don't quite have access to, or we seemingly don't have access to, and yet is always there as a force creating all of life, as I see it. So that's the true nostalgia. So nostalgia is a very powerful emotion. I'm not just trying to get people to be nostalgic about the 80s. I don't think the 80s were actually that good. I think perhaps the true loss is the loss of vision of a more beautiful future. But the truth is, we can have that back. We just have to look at things differently. So a beautiful future is still there, and it will always be there for us.
I can paraphrase that slightly because I know that in a foreign language that might always come through. But what he was saying was that he thought that there was a past that didn't necessarily have to be past. That he thought that there was a history that could be accessed in the here and now if you simply orient yourself toward it. In other words, the sort of thinking involved in the cyclicality that I spoke of earlier. Your past is never actually apart from you. It's just a matter of seeing the broader current of times. So what I would take away from this are a couple of things. One is that the pessimism of the right might express itself in various ways. We might see it appearing in expressive culture every bit as much as we do in public, more formal political expression. But I would encourage everyone to consider the example from not the music, not the scary time cycle stuff, but instead Ernst Jünger. And the referendum I referred to. Because it encourages us to think about the ways that a lack of speech or insincere speech might actually be everybody's problem, and how often we actually depend upon each other participating in democratic conversations in order for this entire project to work. You need not be a doctrinaire lowercase r Republican who believes that there is something almost divine with conversation. You need not have faith in the ability of conversation to bring about truth, to still see something very good in that, and something very fragile, something worth protecting. I'll end on that note, and I very much look forward to your questions, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. That was really fascinating. And I think I'm going to take the privilege of asking the first question, and then I'll go to the public. Because you mentioned Nateland, and I was thinking about this strange phenomenon, which is some similarities between accelerationism and the new right and anarchism. Because they hate the state. They hate the idea of the state. And they value this abstract notion of freedom. But at the same time, they believe in hierarchies and order against chaos. So sometimes it's very confusing, and I understand there's lots of paradoxes around this, the whole issue of the new right. But how could we characterize the differences between, for instance, anarchism in the traditional sense and the kind of despise that these people have for the state and the kind of traditional organizations in democratic societies like the ones we have?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, and it's one way, the reason it's such an important question is that it helps us distinguish these actors from libertarians, with whom they sometimes collaborate, but it has to do with what the end goal is, right? So, both an anarchist, a libertarian, and let's say an ultra-traditionalist have different visions for the future and how to get there, let's say. But where they diverge is their destination, their final destination. For someone like Nick Land, he hates the state, and yet he likes order and hierarchy. The way those two things go together is the belief that, well, if we destroy this state as it is currently constituted and build something else up, then we would find ourselves in a more virtuous situation. Right? Whereas for a more doctrinaire libertarian or anarchist, it might involve anarchy and a loss of state as the actual ends, as the final destination of your work. You believe that without actually state involvement, you've reached some good place. Whereas I think these actors you have to look at them as embracing chaos and anarchy and even libertarianism as a means to an end, as a tool to get to the other goal, which is the reemergence of a society that is indeed very ordered and very hierarchical.
Tem aí o microfone sem fio que vai circular. Então, se vocês quiserem, como eu falei, vocês podem fazer a questão em inglês, ou vocês podem fazer em português e a gente traduz.
Thank you very much for your speech. I was very touched by the idea, as you tried to show us in the beginning, we don't need necessarily words anymore to say, to convey. You know, we have to talk about feelings. And the idea of music, wordless music that says or mobilizes a lot is necessarily a kind of language that touch the body more than the mind. And that is also the strategy of pop culture since the beginning, you know, Hollywood and stuff. And that's what might the far right understood and what not far
Left. Yeah,
the leftists, or the so-called revolutionary, or the resist thing and movements and stuff, had not understood. So what we're trying to say is in some way we have to understand this body or subconscious language more than, you know, this ordered, you know.
It could be. I mean, the question that you get to is, well, is it powerful, right? Because sometimes I can play this music for my students, and the most noteworthy conclusion they draw is that this music sucks. Right?
I hate to say it, but it's catchy.
That is very catchy. It's catchy. Right. Yeah, you start kind of just nodding your head with it. But you tap into, with your question, a question that's much bigger about, okay, were these songs good and were they powerful and did they actually speak to us in some way? Because theoretically, there's a lot to be said about this. Walter Benjamin, for example, this theorist, Eric has read a lot about him, thought that there was something inherently reactionary or right-wing about images, right? And something inherently left-wing or revolutionary about words. The belief was that words would bring sentiment and experiences out into the public, whereas the world of image was much more private. Right? To stay in the German sphere, Richard Wagner, the composer, a lot of his criticism of Jews, for example, had to do with the fact that he felt they couldn't manifest image. He thought they were ugly. That's one thing he writes in one of his screeds against Jews, and a lot of people miss that he wasn't just commenting on them being physically ugly. He thought they didn't possess image. They didn't possess appearance in sight in some deeper metaphysical sense. They were instead people of the book, of the word, of laws, opposite. The consequence of that was that they couldn't be authentic. Right? There was inauthenticity. There was a move instead toward mediation, bureaucracies, organization, mediation, and I've said that already, institutionalization, I mean. And certainly we've seen elsewhere that opposition be tremendously powerful in terms of mobilizing, in terms of reaching out to people, that you can do much more. Sometimes you can galvanize people better with imagery, with sounds, even with music that doesn't have words, right? With the la 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 do do do, there's a parallel there, and that it invites people in, even though you don't quite know publicly what it is that you're doing together. You're still participating. So there's so many connotations that can be brought to that. There are some beliefs that the aesthetics inherent in images are more particularistic rather than revolutionary, and therefore they serve the cause of breaking up a mass. They're anti-globalistic, they're anti-modernistic in that sense. There's also the possibility that I lost my train of thought with that last one. I will come back to that. But the big point of this is that there are deep roots to that opposition, and that it could indeed be worthwhile to think about that more. So thank you.
Hi. Years ago, I've heard about a duo called Prussian Blue. Do you know them?
Who?
Prussian Blue.
Prussian Blue.
It's a duo of white twins, and they sing.
Russian Blue. Yes.
Yeah, they sing neo-Nazi songs or something like that. And when you talk about white power music, I remember them, and just Google them, and I read the name of the music. And one of them is called Road to Valhalla. Other of them is called Ocean of Warriors. Yeah. So why like this movement of white supremacy is so obsessive with Nordic stuff? Is that because the idea of tall, blue eyes and...
So a wonderful question. Yeah, and this is, I'll try to not make this a very long answer. I don't know if Heikki mentioned, I also taught Nordic studies, so this is an interest of mine. So the emphasis and the interest in Scandinavia has persisted. It received a jolt for certainly white nationalist groups because Hitler did that as well. Hitler thought that Scandinavia represented in some way the wellsprings of Germanness and Aryanness, and Scandinavian roots in raw material were cultured and perfected in Germany, but that's really where they come from, right? The odd thing is that in certain places, the Scandinavian diaspora was not considered white all the time. In the early United States, Swedes were not white. And it wasn't a long time, of course, but they gradually moved into and eventually became the whitest of the whites. And Norwegians and Danes, for whatever reason, are not quite as white as Swedes. This has nothing to do with physical appearance, of course, with phenotype. But certainly World War II naming of Scandinavians as ideal in some way. But by the time you also get to the 1940s and 1950s in the United States, an association between Scandinavians and beauty also vaulted Scandinavians to the category of whites and ultra-whiteness in some ways. Having said all that, it's actually a very mysterious process. We know bits and pieces of that history, but I don't think that we understand fully how it took place, how Scandinavians in some racial topographies went from here, not to here, but to there. So yeah, that's a small interest. The neo-paganism aspect of it receives a lot of influence as well, also as a sort of bulwark against Semitic religion. In that case, Christianity and Judaism are grouped together as the same entity, opposite paganism, right? But I think that's not the entire solution. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hi, on the same page with this culture that they use, um, when you say about Ride the Tiger, I thought about a lot when in the 90s there's a heavy metal movement called True Norwegian Black Metal that was known for murders and burning of churches. And not so long ago, I think, past month, a band called Mayhem was prohibited to play here. And you said it so in your book that there are factions that are openly anti-Christian. So in the light that Jair Bolsonaro, Donald Trump, and others proclaim themselves as Christian men, Putin as an Orthodox man, what is the relation between the far-right movement, between these anti-Christians traditionalists and the Christian traditionalists?
That's a wonderful question. And just to summarize again, how could they all be in the same movement? How could Christians and anti-Christians be part of the same cause? And I think to introduce ourselves to the way that this works, we have to think about religion as being symbolic of something else, and as not necessarily holding political value in and of itself for the people involved. That doesn't mean that they can't be sincere in religious beliefs. I really don't know, but in as far as we see it in politics, Christianity can represent nationalism, it can represent a majority identity, it can represent nostalgia for a past, it can represent all of those things. And if you think that that's what it's actually about, then it's not so strange if other people get to those same goals from a different channel. So if someone says that, what's great about paganism, some extreme actor says what's great about paganism is that it's unforgiving, it's not polluted with modernist ideals of masculinity and femininity, it's not polluted with progressivism. Instead, it ties back to the past. And so there's a shared bond in nostalgia there that would lead all those actors to reject the future, right? And that's not mentioning the more peculiar case of Olavo de Carvalho and these traditionalists, like I was talking about earlier, who thought that all that stuff about the time cycle, about hierarchy, about the opposition between spirit and materiality, darkness and light and so on, are kind of the common roots of multiple religions, including Christianity and Islam, and Hinduism, and mystical branches of Judaism. And for them, you can be a Christian, you can be a Muslim, as Olavo de Carvalho was. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that there are two approved branches of the capital T tradition at the bottom. So all of those forces can bring them to play. An alternative state of affairs could bring them into conflict with each other, though. That's part of the logic of political alliance making, is that people with very different agendas can work together if the goals and the conditions are right. Lose those, they might come to conflict. Great question, though.
Thank you very much for the excellent presentation. I got very curious. You started your presentation talking about traditionalism, and then you started giving the examples of the bands, and I got really curious if these bands, are they all together inside only a right agenda, or there are some microcosms over there. Like here in Brazil, we have reactionary conservative. In the United States, there is SDO, RWE, if I'm not mistaken, the terminology. So I would like to know if these bands, they have these microcosmos agendas, or they're...
Absolutely, absolutely. And in fact, there would be some potential aficionados of this music who would want to stop me from saying that like neo-folk is a right-wing music, because it breaks off in some cases. Very much in parallel to the fact that it would be probably inaccurate for me to say that skinheadism is far-right white nationalist youth subculture, because there are a lot of different branches of skinheads that are anti-fascist skinheads, that are not involved in the fight, uncommitted in some way, and just like the style and the attitude embraced that's captured in skinheadism. So yes, the one reason why I think it's important to not simply say that it's a free-for-all, however, that there's no logic underlying why certain expressive forms are embraced by the far right and others are not, is that these styles do carry connotations. Skinhead punk music was, in many ways, I think, a celebration of young male, white male, and at a certain point in time, anger. And that can go in a lot of different directions. But certainly far-right activism, in the sense that we've seen it, is going to be one of those directions. It's not surprising that they manifest there. Nor is it surprising that the neo-folk world, that expressive world, would attract a sort of pessimistic, ethereal-minded, ideological cause. That's not always going to be on the far right, but it can be often. All right. So, but your point is well taken, though. This is very fractured terrain, musically and stylistically and ideologically.
These terminologies are extremely difficult for us here to understand. Difference. Normally we put... Start on? Normally we put everything under the umbrella of far right, and there are lots of small differences that we normally don't know. RWE and SDO, for example, is one that was very...
Okay. Because none of that is ringing a bell with me, but...
I thought it was something very common in the United States, because I read this in a paper a few months ago.
SWO. Yeah.
I'm gonna check.
Please do. Please do.
But it was very interesting for me, because I saw these new terminologies and new specificities about the right coming from the United States that surprised me.
Yeah, well, it's generally something I think that's worth paying attention to. I disagree with a lot of scholars in my field, in my world, in saying that the details matter. There are those who say we really need not to grant any importance to the details between these causes, because they're all dangerous. They all need to be confronted, and therefore any attempt to kind of fracture them makes them more interesting and maybe prevents us from having an effective activism against them. I don't like that as a scholar. It bothers me as a scholar, but I don't like it as a potential activist either. And I do draw a line between those two roles. But so yeah.
I was thinking the idea. I was thinking the idea of the far right to, go to its own end. And do you believe that the far right could eat itself? And that would be not only a freak show, but a dangerous spectacle for all of us.
What do you mean by eat itself?
Go to accelerate in terms of this cycle. Accelerate until something,
Yeah, there's actually a connection there with something that I was going to ask you. If I can connect both questions. Are you finished now? Yeah. Because I was thinking about accelerationism when it began. The basic idea was, capitalism is impossible to defeat. It's unbeatable. So what we have to do is accelerate and make it go, all the way to its end. And I think, of course, that's a failed idea. I think, like when we read the Marxist manifesto, when Marx says, "Oh, okay, capitalism is a market for ideas." So if we keep inserting ideas like, socialism in this market, eventually people will buy this idea, and then we're going to have a socialist state, a socialist government. It doesn't make sense nowadays because we know that capitalism can absorb everything. And some people believe there's a difference between Mark Fisher's approach to accelerationism and Nick Land's, but I'm not sure. I'm really interested in the contradictions of the movement. How they can talk about this brilliant future, which is actually a return to the past, and use technology and embrace the notion that we were better off in the Middle Ages, that kind of stuff. So how do you see those contradictions work in a coherent, because for them at least it's a coherent worldview?
Can you tell me again what the contradictions are, Eric, that you're...
Well, like for instance, when they believe that the spiritual state of mankind was better in the past, right? But in order to achieve this nowadays, you have to go through this technological process, and a lot of people, especially in Silicon Valley, people, like Mencius Moldbug, whatever, they believe we can use this technology to achieve spiritual means and, go back to some kind of, religious state, spiritual experience, something like that.
Right. And could you ever imagine Bolsonaro without technology, without social media?
Exactly.
Right. It's utterly impossible to imagine that cause manifesting. I see a fairly simple answer. I actually see these as two different questions, so I'll address them in that way. To me, there's a very simple answer. They themselves supply this answer. They think that the tools of modernity can be used against it. Right, and that can be actual technology, but it could also be something that's technology plus. Social media is not just, the technology of social media is not the interesting thing, is it, right? It's the users, it's the people, it's the social behavior around it. So that, to them, I think that's how they typically solve that. A popular publisher in this world, Arctos, says that it's making anti-globalism global. That was its old slogan. Let's make anti-globalism global. And they kind of did, in some ways. A question, though, is that if someone actually goes the acceleration route, what does that look like? It would not be the sort of thing the right would do to itself. It's the sort of thing the right would do, I'm sorry for stereotyping you all, it's the sort of thing that the right would do to y'all. Right. Okay, I'm just going to assume, we're given where we are, that this is not a meeting of Bolsonaro, the party. So it's a matter of making mainstream society implode on itself. That sounds pretty darn dangerous to me, and I think we've seen signs of it. I'm more adept to discuss the specifics in the American context. Donald Trump did so much, I wrote about this in my last book, to undermining the state. Some of the first days he was in office, he put people in positions at the head of institutions who hated the institutions. People at the head of institutions who wanted those institutions to be destroyed. They were just one by one, boom, boom, boom. Find a person who hates the education ministry. Find someone who hates the Secretary of State. Consumer Protection Bureau, Environmental Protection Agency. Get people in all those places to blow it up. And by the way, can we find a strategy, and Steve Bannon was very involved in this, can we find a strategy to utterly confuse and infuriate the media so that the media can't function because they're just too angry and too distracted, essentially? Can we do that? The purpose of that was acceleration and destruction in a way. It was more destruction, I would say. That's what the type of tear down would look like to me. That's not as clear an example of acceleration, I think, as we could see elsewhere, but that's the cataclysm aspect of it that you're referring to.
Eu acho que a gente tem tempo para mais umas duas perguntas, 2, 3 no máximo, e depois a gente pode fechar.
Well, good night. This question is not mine. It's from Ronaldo Lau. He's a professor of the FCS, of this faculty. He's watching this now. and he's very curious. So, in fact, he has two questions. The first one would be, what is in fact the relation of these musics with far-right wing movements or waves? Is there any similarity with George Orwell Novilingua in the classic book 1984? What can we do in practice to resist and combat these movements? And the other is, there's a comment. Novilingua aimed to reduce people's ability to reason. These musics have a similar goal. Do these music have a similar goal? And he said he's reading a book by Eduardo Campanella and Marta Dassou entitled L'état de la nostalgia. The book was originally published in English. The authors speak of the nostalgic feeling that permeates modern nationalism. Do these songs fit in there? He loves politics, and he's very curious.
Wonderful. So the relationship between the music that I played and far-right movements is less clear than it had been in the past. In the past, a lot of far-right movements and organizations in Europe and the United States in particular were music organizations. Their magazines were music magazines, and they discussed politics in root. So it's a diminished institutional role for this music. It's primarily consumed on YouTube. I had a question once about the dance music. Someone said, well, are these people getting up and dancing to it and having dance parties? And no, they're not. I'm certain of it. It's consumed in private, and it's decentralized. And that I think too much of the frustration of scholars is because it's hard to study. That's the primary mode of engagement with far-right politics for, I think, the most people these days. It's not congregating in a physical place. It's not buying something physical. It's isolated, atomized consumption of media. So that's one thing. This other question that stuck out to me is, well, there was a point about reason, and this was what I was wanting to say to you earlier, and I lost my train of thought. That there is potentially something anti-modern, or at least a critique of reason and the power of reason and of thinking in rejecting language. Right? That one of the benefits of language is that it can be reflected upon, it can be abstracted in words and scrutinized. If you disallow that process, the only reason you might really want to do that is because you think that the products of reason are not quite as important as others think they are. So I certainly think it's an informed reading of this music to bring that up. As to what to do about it, I'm less certain. It sounds a little precious of me in English. I'm not sure how that expression is going to translate. It sounds a little sweet and naive, maybe, to say that I don't want people to be outside of our conversations. Here, I do believe in privacy. I think privacy is very important too. I'm not a convinced lowercase r Republican in that sense, that I want everything public because I think that's magic in some way. We have to let privacy exist in this world, but I think that we need to make sure that even on the margins of our society, that those people can voice themselves in some way, as uncomfortable and as destructive and as dangerous as we all know that is. I don't think the solution can be silence. I can't always specify why, but I think that having an increasingly large portion of our society mystified and obscured to us is very dangerous. So, my response, but thanks for the questions. Yeah.
Tem mais. E a gente vai passar uma listinha, tá? Para vocês colocarem os e-mails, para a gente fazer uma mailing list do Laboratório de Estudos da Imagem e do Imaginário e para o PPGCOM.
Well, we also have one more comment in the broadcast chat. It's a commentary by Sheila Modesto. I see the lexical conversational narrowing promoted by shortcuts like memes and emojis are similar to the word elimination strategy in Nova Língua. Now, it sounds like an even bigger cultural process.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I couldn't quite hear all of the words that were coming through.
Acho que está baixo o microfone aí.
Yeah.
Você-
Maybe Eric, if you read and reply, then yes.
Hey.
I see the lexical conversational narrative promoted by shortcuts like memes and emojis. The word similar to the word elimination strategy in newspeak. Now it sounds like an even bigger cultural process.
Yes, absolutely. That's a wonderful observation that this spreads in other ways. I mean, in the use of memes and emojis in far-right discourse, that doesn't always qualify as exit in the way that I'm talking about it, but it certainly marks an additional space in which words and language might be retreating. Absolutely, they're taking a slightly less important role in political activism than we would think of in the past. Yeah, so my only response is a thumbs up to that question.
There's
Yeah.
meme magic.
They're meme magic, yes.
The Bible of gag.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, last question. You have to speak on a microphone because we're recording.
It's about a woman. What could you observe in this process of writing a book about women? For example, I'm wondering how the wife of Steve Bannon or Louis in his marriage, or women around them, how they deal with this kind of traditionalism. And every time that you talk about, or when I read the book, I always do a link instantaneously with the paganism. I don't know if there is something to do, or I put these things in my
With paganism.
paganism. There is something to do, and because in paganism, I read a lot of things about the importance of women because they are the organization are matriarchal, and how the first question is how the women how the women deal with this kind of theory, deal not with the mind but deal with if you could observe.
Oh, absolutely. It's again, it's a very big topic. It was as strange as it may sound, the white power skinhead movement, when that came into being, when that really seized white nationalism in the 1980s and 90s, what it offered was actually another expression of feminism, because a lot of the women in these movements were able to essentially achieve an equal status with men. There were fewer of them, there were far fewer, and there are political reasons for that. But they were able to participate in the exact same activities. The music making, something that I follow, be dressed in the same ways, sing in the same ways, play in music bands as well. And so it was bizarrely, I know it feels very awkward to think in those terms about a far-right movement, but it offered new possibilities to women. When skinheadism then declined, we also saw a more limited role for women with it. And the rise of the more reactionary, more deeply intellectual sides of the right, like traditionalism, it not only limits women's opportunities to participate, it also just, based on my observations, there's no survey data on this, but there are just far fewer women participating. And that's noteworthy even despite the fact that there are fewer women in general. And we could say that yes, the pagan elements to this could prescribe a different, offer a different vision, different ideals to women to participate in these movements. And there are some examples of that. There's a famous National Socialist painting that contrasts a Nordic woman standing, proud, naked, with, naked in her body and naked in her head, opposite a Muslim woman and a Christian nun, meant to contrast the pagan spiritualities with the Semitic spiritualities, which they actually would group Islam and Christianity as being part of the same thing, and that they were repressive of women, but paganism would unleash some archaic femininity. The problem is that the types of paganism that tend to be brought into traditionalism and have not been those types of paganism that actually are elevating of women, I think, in the way that some people think they are. For example, Norse mythology, a lot of the Central European mythologies, which are seen as being tied to the same roots as Hinduism in many cases, they actually don't. They have an extremely patriarchal vision of women there too, and when they're put forward, they can often be put in the service of patriarchy, and a sort of hyper masculinity is sometimes also one of the draws to them as well. So people do whatever they want with these ideas, but the big picture story to me is that whereas skinheadism brought more women into the cause, the loss of skinheadism actually pushed women out of it. So, yeah, thank you.
Well, I think that deserves another applause. That was really amazing. I, for one, think it was one of the best talks I've ever heard. It was very informative, very clear, and we have to thank you, Benjamin, because it's been working 24/7 for the last few days, not getting any money, not getting any financial reward, and being very helpful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eric. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming, everyone.
A gente passou uma listinha aí, tá, pessoal, para os e-mails. E esses eventos, assim, que a gente vai continuar organizando dentro do âmbito do Laboratório de Estudos da Imagem e do Imaginário, aqui no PPGCOM. Quem tiver interesse nesses temas, a gente vai estar sempre mandando mensagens com atividades que vão acontecer.
Oh, thanks. Thank you for the questions too.
I think we can go together and do the same.
Oh, okay. Okay.
You drop us off at my place and then
And they'll continue to choose it. Okay.
share.
That sounds great. It's on the way. We'll do it. That sounds great.
Just need to go to the restroom.
Okay.